task leads us into a really important discussion about the form of a text. Here, I'm using the word form to denote things like and categories like the novel, a collection of short stories, a collection of poetry, a graphic novel. All of these are different forms. With each form comes a certain set of conventions. Conventions are like rules, although obviously they're not legally binding. They're things that writers often use when executing a text in that particular form. And equally, they're things that we as readers come to expect from a text. If we pick up a graphic novel, for example, we come to expect that there will be roughly 9 to 12 panels on a page, most pages, that there will be dialogue, that there will be certain structures in place to how the story develops. Conventions for a form are really important for us to understand. They help guide us and our expectations as we are reading. They help us understand the decisions that a writer has made. They're really important when a writer follows those unspoken rules, but they're also important when a writer chooses not to follow those conventions. If we know the conventions of a particular form, then we know when a writer has consciously made a decision to subvert them. And that can be really interesting for you as a reader and important for you to understand when you're trying to analyze the meaning of a text. A really good example of one of these conventions is that novels are usually written either in the third person or the first person. Very rarely do you come across a novel that is written in the second person. But when you do, when a writer makes that particular decision to engage you through the form of the second person, this is a really important and interesting insight into the themes of the text. So here we're talking about the narrative voice and the kind of conventions around narrative voice that come through a novel. We can also talk then about genre. So genre are those categories that maybe you're really familiar with particularly from listening to music, things like blues, classical, rock, pop, etc., our genres of music. Of course, Netflix is the king of genres. We get down into these really genres that are really specific to the algorithm based on what we've watched previously. Sometimes it can be a bit embarrassing when someone else logs into your Netflix account and sees the kind of genres that are suggested to you. But again, genres in fiction, so genres like science fiction and fantasy, romance, horror, magic realism, they all come with their own set of conventions. It operates very similarly to the conventions around form. They develop a certain set of expectations for readers of those genres. And when we unpack what those conventions of the genres are, we get a greater understanding of the decisions that a writer has made and how they might influence us as readers. So let's look at an example using Meadowfish Falling Snow. Meadowfish Falling Snow is a novel. Now, in pretty much every novel that exists, you get a particularly developed character or set of characters and their relationships. It's a longer form, so it gives the writer a chance to explore how and why a character changes. Depending on just how long the novel is, and sometimes depending on what genre it sits within, there may also be a really large cast of supporting characters. So science fiction and fantasy are notorious for this. Often writers who write in those genres will use multiple novels across a series to explore this large range of characters. This gives the writer a chance to develop some really complex relationships. So in the case of Meadowfish Falling Snow, Dylan develops complex relationships both with Pat, her mum's boyfriend, and also with her grandfather towards the end of the text. So the length gives the writer a chance to unpack and untangle these relationships. The length of novels also affords the writer a chance to have the protagonist and other major characters exposed to several major conflicts, whether they're internal and external conflicts. The plot has a chance to unfurl. This is in contrast, say, to a short story, which is quite compressed and only allows one or two major events to happen during that time period. So here we get more of a longitudinal sense of how a character develops. In terms of the genre for Metal Fish Falling Snow, it really fits, I think, within a couple of different genres. One is the genre of the coming-of-age novel, or as it is sometimes called, the Bildungsroman. This is a story where a young person essentially undergoes a journey from the innocence of childhood through to maturity, adulthood. Often that journey is because of something significant and perhaps traumatic that happens to them. So think of every film you've ever watched about teenagers and the way that they undergo significant changes, maybe because of a relationship or the death of a parent. Of course, that's Dylan's story. Her mother has just died, and this is a really significant circuit breaker in her life. She moves from childhood into now a very real sense of adulthood, and it's quite traumatic. Often these novels or films or whatever text fit within this genre will be somewhat of a wild ride as the young person moves from that innocent time of childhood through to adulthood. Because it's hard. It's hard to become an adult. It's hard to grow up in that way. And so this is the case definitely with Dylan. She lashes out at a number of points in the text because she's been forced to essentially mature in a way that she doesn't want to because of the traumatic loss of her mother. The text also has elements of magic realism. Magic realism is a genre that's really popular in Latin and South America, as well as in India and Pakistan and other parts of the subcontinent. The name really tells you everything you need to know. It's a realist text that has magical elements. So it hasn't moved fully into the realm of fantasy, but it uses these magical elements to essentially challenge the way we look at the world. In Dylan's case, she can see into other people's dreams and sometimes into their thoughts as well. That's not something that we think would be necessarily realistic in a text. But Kath Moore includes those elements in the story to give us a deeper understanding of who Dylan is as a character and the very unique way she looks at the world. It's also a response to the way that Dylan is overwhelmed by what has happened to her. Completely understandable reaction given what she's been through. These magical elements are part of Dylan explaining the world to herself. So I'd like you to undergo a very similar task now. I want you to start with the form of your text. I'd like you to identify the form, then do some research into some of the conventions of that form, and you can easily do that with a quick Google search. I then want you to apply those conventions to your novel. Which of those conventions does the writer follow, and which do they challenge or perhaps ignore? I then want you to do the same thing for the genre of your text. There may be multiple genres that your text fits within, so you might need to do a little bit of additional research there. So pause now and undertake that task.